I'm just going to provide a background for this presentation and say that I've been thinking about how when we research mobility, student mobility in higher education, it's generally conceptualized in different ways, but mainly focusing on the migratory aspect, with much of the international literature focusing on students' experiences when they participate in exchange programs, for example, study abroad through the European Union's Erasmus Plus program. While it's important to understand this kind of student mobility, particularly in the growing discourses of internationalization of higher education, there are other more localized mobilities that warrant further attention that I've been recently thinking about in working with young people from an upgraded informal settlement in South Africa. So these are young people who have local experiences of immobility, which is shaped by a kind of social spatial marginalization that I think is overlooked, but has implications for developing more inclusive higher education systems. And as you'll see in the photo essays that I'll share later on, socio-spatial marginalization makes it nearly impossible for young people from Freedom Square, which is the context in which we did our research. It makes it nearly impossible for them to access higher education, but this is not enough reason to justify excluding people living in difficult circumstances or to accept unproblematically that higher education will always reproduce existing social inequalities. So in South Africa, social spatial exclusions and marginalization are linked to apartheid policies that were implemented to restrict access to urban spaces, particularly for Black South Africans. There were influx control measures that were implemented under apartheid rule, accompanied by so-called homeland development for different ethnic groups in the country. In particular, the Group Areas Act was very instrumental in making sure that the migration of Black people to these spaces was channeled particularly to these rural, underdeveloped spaces, instead of allowing Black people to have equal use of the country's space, and particularly to limit their access to white urban towns and cities. So, for example, in the Free State province, Black migrants who were trying to move to Bloemfontein for better life opportunities and to be closer to the economic center in the Free State were settled in Botshabelo, which is about 55 kilometers east of the city of Bloemfontein. Over time, a large component of illegal backyard dwellers came to reside in the area. But with the release of political prisoners in 1990, the dawn of democracy, and moved by spirits of freedom, many people invaded open land and settled informally in different areas across the country. And in the Free State, where we did our research, they settled in the township that is now known as Freedom Square. I refer to it as a township, although it was at the time an informal settlement. But in 1994, when various measures for redress were being implemented, there were also upgrading projects that took place across the country. And they played a crucial role in bringing people closer to the urban center, but also improving these spaces by upgrading infrastructure, housing, and so on. And what's important to consider about this is that being located in the periphery of the city essentially did bring people closer, not only to the urban center, but to higher education institutions like the University of the Free State, where I'm based, but also the Central University of Technology and Motheo College. So although there has been progress, it's been minimal in the sense that there's still a continued lack of development in upgraded informal settlements. Housing consolidation is described as moving quite slowly. There are low levels of satisfaction with the existing housing structures, and the maintenance of infrastructure is a major concern. And I think quite importantly, community-based responses to these problems are largely ignored. And so what we see is that the ability for young people from informal settlements, and this has been found in research in other developing parts of the world, their access to higher education, but also opportunities to improve their quality of life is constrained. And so despite the notable measures that have been taken by the state in South Africa to improve living conditions in Freedom Square, young people living in these contexts often face social, cultural, political, but also economic isolation. So this is what drew our attention to researching what pursuing higher education looks like for young people when they come from informal settlements. And this is in contrast to research that we've done in the past, where we looked at access to higher education for young people who come from rural communities or for those who come from townships. And informal settlements are a particular place which are linked to the legacies of spatial planning under apartheid and have developed a particular culture which is distinct to the kind of communities in rural spaces and in townships. So we did a scoping study on the educational trajectories of youth from Freedom Square, and this project was funded by the SRHE, and we worked on this between 2022 and 2023. We were working with 12 youth volunteers between the ages of 20 and 30, who were recruited through a local nonprofit organization. So data was collected through individual interviews, group discussions, and photo voice, which is what I'm going to focus on today. And through photo voice, they produced photo essays on their aspirations, their past efforts, but also their current strategies, and the impediments that they were facing to accessing higher education. So the prompt that we had given them when they were developing their photo essays is for them to tell us the story of how their lives are progressing since they completed high school and whether or not they had been trying to study further. The project was concluded with a public exhibition that was held at the University of the Free State. And as you'll see shortly, while most of the essays center on issues of unemployment, they also capture how these young people are hustling, so engaged in a variety of sort of short-term hustles or piece jobs, as they call them. And they do this to try and save money, for example, to be able to afford registration fees for higher education, or to keep busy in the hope that something better will come along in the near future. And here are some of the essays. I'm going to take you through 3 essays, and they, in different ways, capture how these young people were attempting to access higher education. The first story is Wake Up and Dream by Lindelwa Mvula. And in her story, she starts off by highlighting that she did, in fact, access higher education. And this is where her story begins. So she gained admission to a local agricultural college. She enjoyed the fact that she had resources that she didn't have before in high school. This is what this photograph is meant to represent, having her own place to study without being disturbed by sharing the space with her younger siblings and so on. She wanted to highlight how she was doing well academically and enjoying her studies. But as many of these young people experience the difficulty of financial instability, which then limits their ability to continue paying for their studies. So she deregisters and she heads back home, and this is what this photograph symbolizes. And when we last saw her, she was at home, unemployed, and sort of going on with daily life and supporting her younger siblings and so on, but still seeing herself as someone who's facing a temporary setback in her higher education journey. The second essay is The Mind is Mightier Than the Sword by Tshepo Swaisa. And he starts off by reflecting on how finishing high school and having to figure out what to do next, he was met with a broken version of himself because he was faced with a lot of indecision. He was engaged in activities that weren't very productive and so on. But he did recognize his strength and resilience. And here is an example of the kind of piece work, so being involved in construction work, garden work, that type of thing. And he says, you know, nothing comes easy, so you have to work for it. And he sees this as an obstacle to accessing higher education, but he's grateful for the opportunity to work and try to save money. He then highlights what a lot of the young people face, so precarity, instability. Although they have access to these short-term jobs, they often lose them quite easily. And he reflects on how he feels that it's his responsibility to make his life good. And this is the brand of a local supermarket where he sees this as an opportunity that God has blessed him with, as he puts it, and that this gratitude will kind of drawing on the law of attraction in a way that the more grateful he is, the more these kind of opportunities will come by, even if they're easy to lose. So through the different types of works that he was doing, he does manage to save up enough money to gain access to the Central University of Technology, where he was studying towards a diploma in marketing. And again, he's reflecting on his resilience and how storms make trees take deeper roots. So he's acknowledging that his hardship is strengthening his resilience and his determination. And I think this is the last photograph of his essay. And again, he doesn't complete his diploma, although he had registered before. So quite similar to the first story where he can't continue his studies. But then he wants to leave a message of hope at the end of his story where he says he wanted to make sure that the second part of his caption is sort of a message to other young people to say their story of how they've overcome what they're facing will become part of somebody else's survival guide. And they all talked about wanting to be involved in the project and to develop these photo essays so that they spread messages of hope, even though things had not turned out ideally for them. The third and final story is by Mudiehi. Just go back quickly to see the title. A Change to Living a Better Life is her title. And this is an example of what you might see in Freedom Square, an example of various developments, construction that's going on in the place, and it's supposed to represent her humble beginnings and the aspiration to bring about change in her community and her family. So most of them talked about their aspirations in this way as being linked to supporting their families and lifting them out of poverty should they complete higher education and have access to good paying jobs. This is a photograph that she shares of her mother who had passed away when Mudiehi was a child. And she's, sort of pursuing higher education as an ode to her mother. This is a photograph that symbolizes that she was taking initiative to go to places within Freedom Square where she could access information about applying to university. And in this photograph, she's showing the example of, sitting in front of the computer, doing the online application process and so on. She gets accepted into a Bachelor of Social Sciences, majoring in psychology, which aligns with her aspiration to be a psychologist. And this is, showing her sort of happy on campus, finally setting her feet at the University of the Free State. So Mudiehi, he's the only young person who gains entry to the University of the Free State. She does complete her modules. She passes them all, and after 3 years, she's essentially done what she needed to complete the degree. But because of having debt, she's not able to access her academic transcript or her degree, so she can't use the knowledge or the actual degree as a currency to gain employment. And so she's trying to save up money to cover her debt so that she can gain so that she can have her transcript. And in this photograph, she still, sees herself as somebody who is defying the odds. And she says she's born for a greater purpose. She's finally completed the course and she's still shining despite having outstanding payment. So if we unpack these photo stories or just look at what they tell us, again, going back to the idea that in higher education, research mobility is explored in terms of movement from one geographic place to another. So that's, the horizontal dimension. But it's also researched in terms of movement in class systems. So upward social mobility, for example, when one has access to university, gains a degree, and perhaps has better opportunities than their parental generation. These essays show that higher education for the young people remains out of reach despite their geographic proximity to higher education institutions. And this in turn further distances them from the social mobility that may come from, for example, gaining a university degree. So their mobility is effectively at the periphery of higher education rather than within it, even though some of them do manage to get in, because even if they do, they drop out or they complete the degree like Mudehi did, but don't have access to their actual transcript and the university degree, which then blocks their opportunities for applying for work in line with what they studied. So what we see is that living in Freedom Square, the youth kind of exist in this liminal space within the social structures of South Africa, where the legacies of unequal distribution of wealth and privilege diminishes their capability for higher education mobility. And this unequal access to opportunities and the supportive social relationships are examples of how the legacy of segregation undermines their attempts to find out what it takes to get into university, to make strategic decisions about accessing the institutions that they qualify to go into, the agency to work and try to save up money so they can cover parts of their fees. All of this is kind of undermined. And ultimately shows how unjust geographies are being perpetuated, despite the fact that this upgrading of these informal settlements has been done to try and integrate and improve lives for people in these places. So I've been thinking about what the capability approach can add to this understanding, because it's a framework that I've been working with for a long time. I'm just going to briefly say that what matters in the evaluation of human development in the capability approach are individuals' freedoms, what they have reason to value in and for their lives, and whether or not they can exercise their agency to achieve their well-being aspirations. And it differentiates between capabilities, which are the effective freedoms that individual has, as well as functionings, which are the achievement of that valued freedom. So the capability approach also takes into account personal, social, and environmental conversion factors. The personal factors are internal, and the social and environmental can be considered as external. These are factors that come into play to either constrain or enable individuals in their attempts to convert resources into valuable outcomes. So what I've been asking myself, that when we think about higher education and higher education mobility as a capability, is there a way in which this approach can be applied as a normative framework to conceptualize how these socio-spatial exclusions that are generated specifically by segregation and residential segregation in particular can affect access to higher education? So that's what I'm trying to do. My thinking is not all the way developed. And I think it's been difficult to do this because there is a marginal intellectual debate on the subject. So relating social spatial dynamics and the capability approach. But these debates are still fairly new. And the intersection between spatial inequalities and human development within developing countries in particular has been largely unattended by scholars. So it's been difficult to find good examples of where this is done, even though it is an area that's gaining traction. So in the capability approach, space and relations within spaces is considered an environmental conversion factor, where the central role here is making sure that people are located within spaces that bring the provision of public goods within their reach. However, I think there is an intrinsic value of place in shaping capabilities, not only in determining the extent to which a person can convert their resources into valuable outcomes. So I think the capability approach can offer a useful framework for expanding conceptualizations of higher education mobility, taking into account the social dimension and the vertical together, as well as how individuals being located in social structures have these valuable opportunities affected by individual, social, and environmental conversions. However, it would be important to identify how social spatial marginalization affects the production of conversion factors but with paying particular attention not only to the existence or having access to local higher education institutions. As I said, the young people are located within close proximity of various higher education institutions. But what matters is also the context and the circumstances in which place affects their lives. If we thought more of the spatial dimension in the capability approach, I think it can help to overcome the limited scope of the approach in seeing place simply as a geographic conversion factor for human advantage, and instead that we might lean on more constructivist and critical notions of place and integrate these into what a conversion factor is, particularly when we're talking about environmental conversion factors, so that places are seen as entities that essentially go beyond their notional boundaries. I'm going to draw some conclusions here, and they're tentative and related to what this means for working towards more inclusive higher education. I think a comprehensive approach to higher education inclusion should consider these spatial issues that I've raised in the presentation, but also how they work together and sort of interact with the social and the economic dimensions. So we're talking about spatial, social, and economic proximity or distance to institutions of higher learning, and that these factors are interrelated and affect the potential of universities to contribute to and develop local communities. When they interact negatively, as we've seen in the photo essays of the youth from Freedom Square, it can result in individuals being trapped in poverty and marginalization. But there is a way for these factors to interact positively, which can then facilitate access to higher education. What I've noticed and what we realized at the exhibition, which was held at the University of the Free State, is that universities hardly focus their outreach initiatives on places like Freedom Square, informal settlements and so on, because they don't recognize youth from informal settlements as valuable role players in the current and future development of local communities. I think if they did, this would increase the potential for higher education to contribute to the just development of cities and society, rather than exacerbating existing urban inequalities that in the South African case are linked to the historical legacies of apartheid and spatial planning. I thought there was another slide, but I think that's it. So I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
Mikateko, thank you so much. Thank you very much for that. Super interesting also to see you bring in notions of place and space and how that's going to come along. I'm now able to open the floor to comments, questions, or queries. So please raise a digital hand, or if you'd like to post questions in the chat if you don't want to be recorded, that's absolutely fine. Perhaps while people are gathering their thoughts, can you say, I'm starting to read much more into the notions of place and space. I'm about to start using it on a project that I've done looking at university campuses specifically. But can you say a bit more about how this could help us with combining with the capabilities to see how that works in relation to particularly marginalized communities, but also more generally? Because it obviously works in, you can, let's say, look at an affluent neighborhood and its relation to the university and see really quite different dynamics going on. So could you say a little bit more about that?
I hope I can. I mean, it's exactly what I'm kind of grappling with, because initially I thought, well, if they are relatively close to higher education institutions, it eliminates one of the challenges that young people from townships and rural areas face, because they don't have to migrate to the urban centers to access higher education institutions. And at the same time, their commute would be shorter because they're much closer by. So with youth from township communities, they often talked about how complicated it was to get to campus for their classes and so on. And what struck me is how close they are. They're literally at the footstep of these higher education institutions and not able to access it. And then thinking about other neighborhoods and suburbs within Bloemfontein where this is not a challenge, which then brings into question, what is it about Freedom Square and this place that makes the pursuit of higher education particularly difficult, despite the fact that in some ways they're closer by to these institutions. So then I started thinking about, how they are distanced in other ways. And then, of course, the limits to social mobility. And then, as I said, place can be seen, or I think, fits into the category of environmental conversion factors. But if you think just about the geographic aspects and not how the culture of the place, the history, the relations between people, whether or not there is a culture of pursuing higher education, whether or not young people are having conversations about what happens after high school and so on, means that the place isn't what it means to come from Freedom Square isn't just an issue of place and geography, but what happens within those spaces. So I think from my understanding, the limitation of seeing place as a geographic conversion factor kind of ignores all these other things in between that happen within that the space. So it's about broadening the notion, I suppose, of environmental conversion factors, so that we don't just think about the geographic dimension, but what happens in the relations between people, as well as culture, history, and considering that the fact that things have improved in Freedom Square, or that informal settlements have been upgraded, doesn't mean that they're fully integrated into wider society. So just a neighborhood that's a few blocks away might have a completely different culture and not suffer from the stigma of having been born as an informal settlement. So they talked about things like that, saying that the only way that they can see their lives really improving is to get out of Freedom Square, because there's a lot more that's holding them back than just the space. There's also a stigma and a culture that's attached to it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It also sounds like the word, you can interpret then the word proximity in quite different ways, because you can be geographically close, but actually effectively miles away, as you're saying, for
Exactly.
different reasons.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, anybody else? Sorry for hogging the space. I was just keen to jump in on that one. Carmen? Hi.
There we go. Marriage. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
We can hear you and see you.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, thank you, Mikateko, for that presentation. And it's wonderful to see the stories from the students, from the Freedom Square youth, as I was there in South Africa while the project was going on. So thank you about that. I was wondering whether, in relation to your last comment, whether your point about broadening the geographical dimension of the capability approach is not necessarily about broadening the notion, but rather a limitation of the approach, and whether we need an alternative framework that can bring the limitations of the capability approach to acknowledge that mobility and immobility. So it was just, yeah, a question about that. Yeah.
Yeah, it may very well be that it's a limitation that's pointing to the need to either work with a different framework or complement the capability approach with other frameworks or other theories. And I think towards the end, I did, allude to more constructivist leanings of notions of space and geography, which perhaps the capability approach doesn't do enough of. So I just need, some time to kind of explore what other approaches might be complementary. Because as you said, Richard, they're so close yet so far. And yet in the capability approach, one would assume that their proximity to these institutions, to resources, to information, which they do have, would make it slightly easier. But it's not. I mean, in my view, they're even further away from accessing higher education than the rural youth are, the ones who've had to migrate to come to the University of the Free State. They're even further away. Yeah. But thanks, Carmen.
Sorry, Beth, over to you.
Thanks so much for that presentation. I'm really interested in this notion of place because we're working on a lot of place-based research currently around Morecambe, and one of the things that we've been doing has been really challenging that notion that in order to progress and to achieve in life that you need to necessarily leave those places, that's the only way in order to progress in your life. So I'm really interested in sort of anything more that you can say about that. But also I thought the three stories that you shared were really interesting in terms of how they'd been created through those photos, and there definitely seemed to be a sort of theme of hope despite some of the challenges and some of the barriers that had got in the way of them accessing higher education. So was that something which sort of came through across all of the sort of stories that you heard from the young people and the students? So was there that sort of that thread of hope running through them, because they all sort of seem to include at least a couple of positive images that sort of looked to the future. So even despite not being able to achieve their degree or from dropping out, that they didn't necessarily, they hadn't given up hope yet. So anything around sort of those two would be really interesting to hear about. Thanks.
Thanks, Beth. Yeah, they were overall quite hopeful. So there were some stories that detailed the struggles with alcohol abuse, involvement in unproductive activities for young people, and how the temptation to do that is so strong in Freedom Square because you're surrounded by young people who sort of look like their lives are going better. And once you have conversations with them, this is what they said, then you find out that they're, engaged in all sorts of questionable activities. So there were more examples like that. There were examples of people who didn't manage at all to access higher education, despite the fact that they tried. There were examples of people who access institutions that were of questionable quality, sort of fly-by-night type of institutions, to indicate the desperation that's there to, go somewhere where you can get a piece of paper that proves that you're worth something. And so there was range in their stories, but they definitely wanted to communicate hope, because when we told them that the project would be concluded with a public exhibition where their family members or community members and other young people would be able to attend, they said they wanted to encourage young people to try and make it happen, that perhaps there was something in their approach that made them fail, but they didn't want to send a message of hopelessness, despair, and failure to other young people. So hope was a major theme across most of the stories. Even if it wasn't central, usually the last photograph had a hopeful caption or image in it. And then when it comes to the question of not leaving these places, they talked about not being able to see any other way out. They said, well, if you look around, the people who are making it are those who are, involved in gang activities and so on. So those are the role models that they have in their communities. And they, even coming to campus on that one day for the exhibition, they were noticing differences in how they were dressed compared to other young people. For some of them, they'd never been to the University of the Free State at all, which is a gated campus, which means even if you did want to make use, for example, of the university library to find out information about how to apply and so on, you need to have a student card to access the premises. So I think, when they step outside of Freedom Square, they don't have to travel far to start seeing examples of people who are living better lives than they are. And so to them, it sends a message of nothing really gets better here. Things are marginally better. Freedom Square looks more or less like a regular township, but once you spend more than just a few hours there, as we did when we were facilitating the workshops, you start to get a sense of the culture and a feel of what people's everyday lives are, which can be quite demotivating. So unfortunately, their view was the only way to kind of guarantee that their lives are better is to find a way out, which of course they also can't do. So they are stuck in many ways.
Can't see any pathway of people like them who can get out of that, but then they also they're sort of stuck with the current pressures that they're experiencing at that time as well, and having to negotiate that. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah,
thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, Paul, please.
Hi, Mikateko, lovely to see you. Yeah, I was kind of interested in kind of the extent to which you got a sense of the kind of almost the institutional form of higher education being the barrier. There's a sense from their accounts about how useful the education is, but there's almost that the institution itself, rather than the education it offers, is something that is almost too difficult to navigate. And that, I was really struck by the kind of cruelty of that situation of having completed a degree that you can't get hold of, which would be the thing that would allow you to pay for the degree. It's just feels like a kind of form of madness that must be so frustrating. So that that kind of sense of if there's something in the institutional form of the university that kind of stops people being able to access it, and also kind of, I think it's probably two questions rather than one. I'm being a bit inappropriate, but the other thing was that those messages of hope didn't really seem to be for them or reflect of their experience. It almost felt like, well, I can't say it's as bad as it is. What does that give other people? So in a way that feels like something different, and that, and I think that's one of the things with Photo Voice, isn't it? It's kind of, it captures accounts, but it also captures a kind of different positioning in the world that isn't a reflection of where you are. It's partly a reflection of how you want the world to be. And I think, in a way we might read them as too hopeful, because actually part of it is, my goodness, is as dreadful, and I don't want it to be this dreadful. So I'd just be interested in your thoughts on that. But thanks, it was a fascinating presentation.
Thank you. Thanks, Paul. I mean, I don't know what to say about the first question on institutional form and all the different ways in which how universities operate, not just in terms of what it takes for them to issue you with your transcript, but also the application procedures that are, quite cumbersome. And if you don't have someone who's done this thing before, and of course, if you haven't, sort of sat through the whole process, getting advice like Mudiyehi did, it can be from the get-go really complicated. Including things like advice on what to study, because none of them had examples from their own families where they might, draw on advice, information on that level as well. So Tsepo, who studied the marketing diploma, did talk, quite candidly about the fact that young people are encouraged to study beyond high school. but he was like, what is it actually going to result in? I mean, I'm doing this because it's the only thing that kind of half makes sense. And not doing it doesn't make sense either, but I don't really see, you know, where this is going, because we're looking amongst ourselves, the 12 who have volunteered, and there weren't any success stories. So I do think that universities are very off-putting to young people like them. And I think the added dimension of not being able to set foot on campus without a student card, or if you do, you have to go through the visitor's gate and sign a form and this and that. And it's a space that if you're unfamiliar with, just being on campus and trying to figure out how to get to the administrative building, or where you can get academic support, or talk to somebody who can provide information about the National Student Financial Aid Scheme, it's yeah, it's quite daunting for many people. So I do think that that's a big issue. And then with photo voice, I mean, there's a temptation to present stories that are aesthetically pleasing, and that will draw a favorable response, if you will, from the audience. Although we encourage them to take photographs that represented their everyday settings as much as possible. Many of them did choose to rather go for photographs that were staged. And, you know, they thought very carefully about where the photograph was taken or what they were wearing on the day, and things like that. So I think there is a pressure to present stories that are hopeful and aesthetically pleasing, even though, you know, we tell them they don't have to be. Once they see one or two examples of a photo essay, then they also want theirs to be beautiful. And I think that's part of what you know, encourages them, if you will, to send a message of hope, because when the exhibition happens as well, they want to present themselves in their best form and say, well, you know, my life might not be going the way that I wanted, but I'm not a useless person. I'm not somebody who doesn't try. And at the same time, my life isn't completely miserable. So I think it's difficult to kind of strike a balance where these visual narratives do well to capture both the despair and also the hope. Yeah.
Mikateko, I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about photo voice and how it gave you something that other approaches didn't. I mean, part of that is, of course, the methodological question as to why, but what did it give you that other approaches wouldn't have done? You know, in a way, we could just think about the kind of the standard approach of interviews and focus groups, and that gives you something, but not others. What is it that photo voice added to this project that allowed? I mean, the pictures are enormously evocative, and they're also very creative in the way that people, you know, express themselves and what they take photos of, which is super interesting. But can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, that's a difficult question, actually, because I've been working with photo voice for a while now, and in this project, what I thought it would bring is the highlight the visual aspects of how an upgraded informal settlement looks, because it's a difficult thing to explain to people who haven't been to an informal settlement or favela or something like that, and to see what it means for a place to be upgraded and improved, but still lacking in the markers of a normal neighborhood. So I thought that's what it would bring visually when we report on the findings. And then what I know it usually brings for the participants is something new. It's this fun way of thinking about one's life, of engaging with other young people, of having a digital camera that you carry around with you for a week or two, and exploring your neighborhood, your home environment, the spaces that you frequent daily, and looking at them through the lens of a camera and thinking about how you want other people to see it. So I know that young people often value that aspect of talking about or sharing their experiences in a way that is more creative, that doesn't rely completely on the one-on-one interviews, which capture much more detail about high school, about their families, about their aspirations, and so on. So I'm going to have to say I'm not sure. You know, at the beginning of using photo voice, you think it's going to do one thing, and then it doesn't necessarily do that. I can't say resulted in empowerment and social change, which is how, we typically talk about participatory type of approaches to research. It didn't do that. So I think probably the participants got more out of it than what we did methodologically, as a way of complementing the interviews and the focus group discussions. So it's a really good question. Yeah, I like to use photo voice because I think young people enjoy it, and I think it often results in reflections that they just come about differently to a one-on-one conversation, especially because they're working as groups, and we do these workshops and we're together the whole day and we get to know each other, and there's a trust, I guess, and a camaraderie that's built through the process, which might not be achieved through individual interviews. But yeah, I'll say I'm not sure what we got this time out of photo voice that we might not have gotten if we just did the interviews.
In a sense, if they got more from it than you do, I mean, in a way, that's a good thing. Okay, methodologically,
yes.
Incrementally, it's not useful, but actually, there's a joy there too, at the same time, which is not just about what you're getting from them. In a sense, it's then interesting.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, anyone else? I realize I'm hogging space here. And what's next after this project?
Another good question. I don't know. So we did it as a scoping study because we thought informal settlements are under-researched. And then we had a hard time finding local NPOs that were operating in these spaces or working with young people, which is why we ended up doing this project in Freedom Square, which is not what we initially had in mind. So we wanted to work with an unupgraded informal settlement. So I think that probably still needs to be done. I do think there are unique challenges to accessing higher education that are different to youth who are marginalized in other ways. And I do think it's an area that can, sort of broaden or expand how we think about place and geography, and the shortcomings of the capability approach in my case in terms of how we think about conversion factors. So I think what's next would probably be a wider project. We work with a very small group of young people, and perhaps also trying to see if we might be able to recruit those who do actually make it in and succeed and get their degrees, to see if their trajectories play out differently to other young people who've been marginalized in different ways. So yeah.
Muting myself. Yeah, let's see. I mean, it's going to be really interesting to see how it goes. There's so much work that looks at the social distance of universities from some people, and other places that look at the geographic, and then putting them together actually does something else, particularly in particular kinds of communities, which you might not see in some places, but then you definitely do see in others. As you said, if you haven't been to a favela, in a way, you don't know, you can't imagine what it's like. So
that's right. You put that very nicely, and I hope I'm able to develop a paper that kind of highlights the intersection of the social and vertical aspects of mobility and where place fits into this, and all of that. It's a new area for me because I typically work and ask questions that have to do with what happens while young people are in higher education. So looking at these issues of space and geography and mobility is relatively new. But very interesting, and I'd like to explore it more.
Yeah, maybe we can have a longer conversation about that. But if there are no more questions, it's my job as the chair to draw things to a close. So first of all, again, so nice to see you online this time, Mikateko, but also to hear more about this work, which is super, super interesting. So I also need to say that the next online seminar will take place on Wednesday, the 30th of April. So it's a while away, Easter in the way. Also at 12:30, and will be presented by Yuhan Wu, who is going to be talking about Du Bois Really Needs Saving, a critical exploration of boy crisis, learning from the Chinese case. So that's the next one. And Mikateko, again, thank you very much. And also to people for coming and talking.
Yes, thank you all for being here. Thank you for your patience at the beginning. And I hope to be able to visit Lancaster again in person soon. Thank you.
Hopefully,
Bye-bye.
yes. Take care. Thank you.
Yes,
Bye.
bye.